Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cass's talk on franchising. I'll get started. So today, will be presenting on the fastest way to register your franchise in Malaysia and 5 tips on how to select an awesome franchisee. The key takeaways that you will receive today is the benefits and challenges of franchising. It is an interesting journey, but not an easy one. Fastest way to register your franchise, tips on selecting the right franchisee, and also key points for franchisor to take note of. The webinar will take about 1 hour. Please do have questions. Let's make it interactive. And you can save your questions and I'll address all your questions towards the end. Just a very brief introduction to CAS. CAS has been around since 1999. That's 24 years. And our franchising services include drafting franchise agreements, drafting franchise kit and a franchise application form, preparing documentation for franchise registration. We do franchise disclosure documents, preparation of relevant manuals for franchising, and also the registration of franchise with the relevant ministry in Putrajaya. We have 17 years of experience in franchise, and we are located in 7 countries in the ASEAN region, and we have 90 personnel in CAS. Our 3 core services are intellectual property rights, which comprises of trademarks, patents, copyright, industrial designs, and so on. And we also have translation. We translate to various languages in the ASEAN region, and franchising. All right. About our clients, just for you to have an idea of the franchise clients that we have assisted in the past, in Malaysia and in other countries as well. And they range from F&B industries, education companies, tile company. Faruni is a tile company. Johan Speaking Academy is a speaking training, public speaking training, and so on. Here are some of our client testimonials. This one's from Bata, and this one's from Johan's Public Speaking Academy. All right, so getting into the nitty-gritty content of this presentation, let's start first with benefits and challenges of franchising. The benefit of franchising is the main reason everyone gets into a franchise. And very often we speak to business owners about expansion. All businesses look at scaling up, and scaling up and expansion is when franchising comes into play. It is a business model that allows a business owner to have access to capital with um, with funds, not their own funds. They can actually expand. So without their own funds, without putting in their own injection of revenue, they can still expand in a specific region or a specific country. Because the cost of expansion, the cost of setting up a new outlet is borne by the franchisee. And that capital then becomes available by franchisee taking loans, not the franchisor taking loans. So that is a huge advantage because in a traditional business, in a non-franchising business model, the franchisor has to invest their own capital to open the outlet, to hire their own staff, to do the marketing, to expand the business in that specific country or region. So the traditional business is where the business owner has to expend their own expenses and their own funds and put in capital. This makes a huge benefit to the business owner, and that's why franchising is a very attractive business model. Also, it increases brand awareness. Why is it that all of us, those who are tuning into the webinar, think about it? Why is it that we know McDonald's and we know about Starbucks and we know about Tea Life? Let's give a local flavor. And we know about Mary Brown. Tea Life and Mary Brown are not everywhere in terms of billboards. They're not on radio stations. They're not on TV stations. So the brand awareness for these brands come from the fact that there's more and more locations. So when you drive to Puchong, you drive to Penang, you drive to Johor, different states in Malaysia, You see all these brands because there's so many outlets. That is where there is increased brand awareness. What happens when there's increased brand awareness? There's more trust in the brand. When there's more trust in the brand, there's more traffic and there's more profit. So it allows franchisors to access new markets and territories and increase their performance in terms of branding and marketing. As mentioned earlier, it helps a business scale up. There's efficient growth. And the reason there is efficient growth is because it is easier to manage a franchisee and more rules that can be imposed all through the franchise agreement. So if they do not follow the rules and regulations, then you can terminate the franchise. So that creates a culture of consistency, and consistency creates growth. Also, supply chain, you have an easier supply chain with more franchisees. One gets to negotiate for better prices in terms of suppliers products. And so as mentioned here, franchisor can strengthen existing reputation and customer brand base. And in once you spot new locations, they can reach to customers and promote growth in business. So the supply chain gets stronger with a franchise business. So, I mean, in my opinion, the franchise business model is has more benefits and disadvantages. And that is why it's a very popular business model and it started from the US. US is a market with 52 states. It's very difficult for a business owner to expand rapidly when there's 52 states and a wide geographical region. So that's how franchising actually began. And if those of you have not watched the movie The Founder, I highly recommend it. The Founder, um, please take notes, right? The Founder is a movie about the history or how McDonald's started. And it's very interesting because it talks about the entrepreneurship journey. And many of you know that Ray Kroc is the guy behind the growth of McDonald's franchise. And he was not the founder of, ironically, is the same name of the movie, but he is not the founder of the McDonald's brand. There were two brothers who were the founder, but he bought the brand from them and bought the business from them. Have a look at the movie. Highly recommended, especially if you're thinking of franchising. So, challenges of franchising. Someone Finding the right franchisee can be challenging, and that's why also today I will be addressing how do you find the right franchisee? What tips can you get from us to get a right franchisee? Finding the right franchisee isn't easy, and it's a process that you need to go through. Also, maintaining consistency. Earlier, I said that consistency is there because there's franchise agreement and there's rules and regulations. So it contradicts when how come that's also a benefit, but it's also a challenge. Well, and a franchisee has the qualities of an entrepreneur, right? So they're not your employee. They run their own Sendirian Berhad private limited company. So they have ideas of their own, and that's the challenging part because they have ideas of their own and they are like an entrepreneur, they want to do things differently sometimes. And maintaining consistency is difficult when they start doing different things without asking you for permission, or they start going their own direction. Or this strategy is better, let me market this way, let me change my product list, let me add some local flavors, and so on. So that's a challenge. It's not that it's unable you're not able to overcome them. You're definitely able to overcome them, but these are the challenges that's important to know if you're entering the franchise business model. Offering franchisee support. Many a times I tell clients that when you as a business owner become a franchisor, your main business of running that, whether it's a tile outlet or whether it's a restaurant or education center, whatever the main business is, you need to start letting go to your general manager or someone else to give them the authority to run it, because your energy then goes to supporting all of your franchisees. Your franchisees need support because they are taking up the franchise, your business model, because it's successful. It's tried and tested. It makes profit. So when they take up that franchise, they actually need the support. How do you run your business, right? They are not familiar with your business. And that's why the support is very, very important. Then you have the other challenges is brand reputation management. Uh, this is related to consistency. Franchisee are not employees. Franchisee are entrepreneurs, and with their own ideas, sometimes they can do that. They can do different things in the business, which you do not allow. And when it's not allowed or it's dangerous, it can tarnish the brand reputation. And can you imagine if you're running 100 franchisees, all having their own entrepreneurial mind, creative mind, they're innovative? That's when it's very dangerous. And that's where the best franchises are very strict with their rules. And franchisees are always monitored. Other challenge is legal and regulatory compliance. This is, it varies country to country. And I think I'll give some examples later as well on how it is in ASEAN region. Now, why should you register your franchise? Well, there's high court decisions to push in this direction. Also, our country, Malaysia, is regulated by the Franchise Act 1998, and it's a requirement under the Franchise Act 1998 to have the franchise registered before any offer for the franchise is made to the public. Now, let's look at two cases. SP Multi-Tech Intelligent Homes is a case where it related to retail smart home concept. Here, what happened is the relationship went sour between the franchisor and the franchisee. And when one party took the action against the other, um, the franchisor was asking the franchisee to follow the rules set, and the franchisee refused. And when the franchisor tried to enforce that agreement in court, that agreement was found to be unlawful and void. So it's very important that agreement must be allowed to be enforced in court, right? That's how that's why agreements are entered into. The fact that if the other party does not follow or adhere to the terms of the agreement, the party that has the terms breached and is suffering from that should be allowed to go to court to take an action. That's the entire basis of why you have a legal agreement, that there's legal recourse. So it's interesting here because this agreement was found to be unlawful and void, uh, and the on the basis that it was not registered, right? On the basis that this franchise was not registered with the franchise registry. Now, the other party, the franchisor, explained in court that this agreement was not dated, this agreement was not stamped, and without an enforcement and expiry date, it showed that it was the intention of the parties to enter into this business arrangement, but they were both waiting for the franchise to be registered. They said that because it was not stamped and because it was not dated, even though both parties signed the agreement, it was an understanding that there was a waiting period to have the franchise registered. The court found that that was not the case. The business relationship already began. There was already the outlets being set up, sales being done. So that was not the intention, even though it was not stamped and it was not dated. So interestingly, this case found the agreement void, and the franchisor couldn't. The franchisor was ordered to refund all payments and benefits received to the franchisee. Next, we have okay. So what is interesting also in this case is that the High Court and the Court of Appeal found that the master licensing agreement, which was the name used for this agreement, they didn't call it a franchise agreement. So the master licensing agreement falls within the definition of a franchise because of these 5 elements that were found in the business. First, that there was a grant of a right to operate a business, a franchise system, right? There's a grant to a right to operate a business like a franchise system. Then there was use of franchises, trademark, and other intellectual property rights. There was a fixed duration for this relationship, where the franchisor possesses the right to administer continuous control. So there's continuous control by the franchisor to the franchisee's business operations. And there was a payment of fee. So these 5 elements reflected that it is a franchise. No matter what you call it, it's not a license, it's a franchise. Hence, this agreement is a franchise agreement and not a license agreement, and hence this should have been registered in the franchise registry. Another case to bring to your attention is the Dr. Premanathan against Permai Polyclinics. Here, the High Court found that there was no franchise system, even though the agreement refers to the money that was collected as a franchise fee. Right? Throughout the agreement, it says franchise fee of 10% that will be collected. And there was no franchise system found because there was no exercise of continuous control. In this case, it was a sole practicing doctor, Dr. Premanandan, and he had an agreement with Permai Polyclinics, where Permai Polyclinics is a corporation that gets panels, gets financial institutions, get companies, um, gets Dr. Premanandan as a panel doctor on these other companies, all these large companies. So Permai Polyclinics said, I can bring you patients and I can bring you bulk patients. And that was the agreement. It was called a management service agreement, right? And the 10% franchise fee was actually on all the billings or the charges made to the patients. 10% of that charges made to the patients will go to Permai Polyclinics. That was how the fees were collected. Here, the courts looked at the management service agreement, looked at the business relationship, and found that, wait a minute, that this is a different relationship. It's not a franchise system. And even though the franchise fee was used, the words franchise fee was used, it is not a franchise system. So the other party could not claim that it's a franchise agreement that's void. So that is interesting because this case was very different from this case. And you can see that these 5 elements need to exist before any business relationship is considered a franchise. So for those tuning in, you might already be running your own businesses. You might be licensing the businesses to third parties or entering into a joint venture with third parties. So you can analyze whether is your business a franchise that should be registered with the franchise registry, or is it a different business arrangement that doesn't actually fall under the Franchise Act 1998. If you have any questions at all about this on whether your business should be registered or not, because sometimes that's one of the frequent questions that we get, we can help you analyze your business and explain which does it fall under and whether are you in breach of the Malaysian Franchise Act 1998. Right. How do you register your franchise in Malaysia? It's very ironic because as we were promoting this franchise webinar, I was getting messages, some from potential clients and some from actual existing clients. And one of the question was, my team can do it, right? It's very easy, right? And even though we put the fastest way to register your franchise, it is a very tedious process. It's a very tedious process that can be made very long if you do it on your own, and there could be various mistakes that you incur during that entire process. So what might usually take 6 months to 8 months might end up being 2 year long. So earlier I mentioned different countries have different laws. Malaysia has the Franchise Act 1998. We have to adhere to this act, and this act was amended in the year 2020. Vietnam is also where a registration is needed. A registration process is done through the Ministry of Trade by submitting a dossier. Thailand and Singapore do not have any regulations, any legislations. So they do not need to adhere to any legislations. There's no registration process, but they do have a code of ethics, and it is recommended that agreements between both parties adhere to the code of ethics. In Indonesia, registration is required, and that is done through Surat Tanda Pendaftaran Waralaba and also under a ministry. Philippines, registration is also needed. There's an intellectual property code, civil code, and corporation code, and other special laws that must be adhered to. And in US, it's really US is a really interesting market because it's not a federal registration. It's not one registration on a federal, and you can enter all the states. US franchise system differs from state to state. We had a client asking for how do they enter 4, 5 states in the US, and each state has a different procedure. So it can be quite cumbersome, right? And franchising requirements where it is quite harmonized, the information that's asked will be this type of information: the market size, what system is being used, What is the product that you're offering to the public, or what service are you offering? Is there a trademark or any IP that needs to be protected? Has it been protected? And they look at duplicability, which is through the operation manual and training manuals. What's the competition like? In which market entering into? And finances. So in Malaysia, the franchise registry in Malaysia will look at, is it a healthy business that can be franchised? Right? If it's suffering and loss, how will the franchisee even earn a revenue, or how will the franchisee make returns on investment? The ideal case scenario is that a franchisee must make back their money within 3 years of entering into the franchise, right? And that's very easy to reflect. I mean, if you are investing in any business, you would like to make the money back as soon as possible, and then whatever you earn after that is your profit, right? Otherwise, it's you're still trying to make back the money that you put in. So the financial situation of the company is very important. For that reason, right, the finance reason is why Malaysia requires a company that has been around for 3 years as a requirement before they can franchise their business in Malaysia. So definition of franchise, the Franchise Act defines franchise as a contract or an agreement, either express or implied, whether oral or written, meaning that it doesn't even need to be written. It can be a verbal of business arrangement, and it has the granting the right to operate, right to use trademark, continuous control, and paying a fee, a royalty or franchise fee. Now let's look at key provisions of the Franchise Act. And the reason this is important is it's the fastest way to register your franchise. I think I'll come to it later, but it's very important to know what you need to do. Franchise Act gives key provisions that must be included in the franchise agreement, key provisions that must be adhered to, and also states what is supposed to be in the content of a disclosure document and the rules behind a disclosure document. For example, a disclosure document must be given 10 days before a franchisee needs to decide on whether he's taking up a franchise. Some of the important provisions of the Franchise Act is Section 6, where this is the one where there's a penalty. Failure to comply with registration of a franchise before operating the franchise or offering them to Malaysians is an offence. And the fine can be quite hefty. It's 500,000 for a body corporate if it's a company, or 250,000 for non-body corporate and individual. And for the individual, there's chances of imprisonment as well. And foreign franchisors have to register if they're offering a franchise in Malaysia. Now, application for registration, this is where when the client was asking whether his team can do it, and actually it is possible, but there's so many nuances that needs to be looked into. Section 7, the application for registration, says that the application must have all of this disclosure document, and the disclosure document itself is like 10 pages long of information that needs to be provided. The sample of franchise agreement, the operation manual, the training manual. Operation manual and training manual also have a way of being drafted because there are certain chapters that must be included in the operation manual. There's certain chapters that must be included in the training manual as well. Also, a copy of latest audited accounts and financial statements and other information that the registrar might need, marketing strategy, and technology used as well. Section 11 addresses amendments. So if there's any amendments, then those amendments, any amended documents must be submitted to the registry. This is the part about where it's compulsory that the franchise agreement and disclosure document must be given 10 days prior to the signing of the franchise agreement. So if a disclosure document is not given to the franchisee 10 days before, it's a breach of the Franchise Act and there will be a penalty. Another requirement is actually registration of trademark. It's very interesting because the act was started in 1998. In the early years, an application for a trademark was sufficient. But now, lately, the franchise registry has been enforcing that it must be a registered trademark. See, it becomes very tricky because registration of a trademark in Malaysia takes 1.5 years to 2 years. Could be longer if the trademark is descriptive or is similar to an existing trademark and an objection arises. So that is where the franchise registration gets delayed if it's pegged onto a trademark being registered. So the older version of where only applications are needed were actually better. And we've spoken to the franchise officers actually about this, requesting for them to take into consideration that it should be a franchise application that's considered, not a not a trademark application that should be considered, not a trademark registration, which sometimes only happens 2 years later. They haven't got back to us. So back to this. Um, we have asked, Cass has asked them to give a leeway to the registered trademarks part, make sure it's just an application form that's needed, but they are considering it. So I think this part, at the moment, is still a registration of a trademark. So on that, if you're looking to franchise anytime in the near future, please start your process, because this itself takes about 1.5 to 2 years. In most countries, it takes about 1.5 to 2 years. All right, so as per the topic of this webinar is that how can you register your franchise fast? There's 4 tips, right? One is to have a comprehensive operations and training procedure. The training and operations procedure is then put into a manual. Many a times we start the process, and we can also draft the operation manual and a training manual, but sometimes the client who knows their business better prefers to do it. But that takes a long time when you don't have a consultant assisting, and that can be a huge delay. So if you are new in the business and you haven't met your 3-year timeline, because Malaysia requires 3 years of audited accounts, if you haven't met the 3-year timeline, then the best advice we can give is start your operation manual and your training manual immediately while you're running your business, while you're waiting for the 3 years. Because when you come to the 3 years, you have all your documents in place, and the franchise registration process is so much faster. So that's very important, operation and training procedure, the SOP. Uh, the next one is choosing and appointing the right consultant for both business and legal advice. It might not even be franchise, right? We're not referring exactly to franchise. Sometimes we need projected accounts, projected sales, for example, because we want to see, can the franchisee actually make back their returns on investment. So all of this means that if you can't do it in-house with your accountant, you have to get a finance consultant to help you project it, right? And legal advice, franchise agreement, you might need to go to a consultant or a lawyer to have that done. So all of this is, if you get the right and suitable experts, is again done with least amount of mistakes in the fastest way possible. Next is ensure that you have your basic strategy of the business, and make sure the practices are practical. So the strategy of the business comes into it being in line with your franchise strategy, because one of the requests from the franchise registry is, what's your marketing strategy? So that all ties in with your business strategy. And develop a clear, updated marketing and sales plan, clear core concept that's needed. So that's the fastest way to register the franchise. And these are questions that the franchise registry will also interview the franchisor on. All franchise registrations that are submitted to the franchise registry will trigger a visit to the outlet and an interview process with the franchisor who is applying for the registration. Anyone has any questions on this part, please feel to unmute and ask, because I can also stop during the presentation if that is easier for you. Anyone with any questions? Okay, if not, I'll move on to the next one. So the fastest way also is to get all the documentation in order. So this part is a bit on franchise agreement and what are key provisions that you need to include. Section 18 of the Franchise Act is actually really important because it states that all franchise agreements must contain these provisions: the product and business description, the territorial right to granted to the franchisee, franchise fee, promotion fee, royalty, or any related type of payment which may be imposed on the franchisee, or obligations of the franchisor and franchisee. The use of intellectual property rights. In this part, the use of intellectual property rights, is part that are not allowed. What happens if there's a breach? What if there's a termination of agreement? What happens to the use of IP rights, and so on? Whether can you change the IP rights? What if there's amendments to the trademarks, and so on? Assignment of rights, can either the franchisor or franchisee assign their rights in this agreement to a third party? If can, then what are the conditions? Cooling off period. Cooling off period is where both parties, um, the franchisor gives the franchisee a cooling off period, which means after he has signed the agreement and he changes his mind within the cooling off period, then he is allowed to do so. So it's unusual because in a willing buyer, willing seller, or willing parties entering an agreement, usually it's not allowed. In Contract Act, it's not allowed that you suddenly change your mind 7 days after. I think the cooling off period in Malaysia is 7 days. And here is that the party can actually change their mind after signing the agreement due to this provision of cooling off period. And the cooling off period provision must be included in all franchise agreements. Also, what's the franchisor's assistance that they will be providing, and the franchise duration and renewal. Renewals are also tricky because renewals must be given unless there's a very good reason not to give a renewal, very good grounds not to grant a renewal. Then you have termination or expiration of the contract. Non-compliance of Section 18, which is the term that we went through earlier, is considered an offence. And the court has the authority to declare the franchise agreement null and void upon sentencing. So it's very interesting where the agreement can be considered void if it does not adhere to the Franchise Act. And that's why it's very important to adhere to the Franchise Act. So the franchise agreement, well, the purpose is really to put the relationship into writing. All the do's and the don'ts, all the can do's, all the can'ts, what happens if things go wrong as well. So basically, consequences of anything that going wrong must be spelled out. So do ensure that your franchise agreement is well drafted. A well drafted franchise agreement actually takes you really far. And there's so many permutations that can go wrong, including, for example, when you do give out a franchise, can the franchisee open their own Instagram account? Can their franchisee open their own Facebook account? How do you have control if they are managing their own Facebook account, their own Instagram account? If anything goes wrong in the relationship, how do you then take back control? How do you get their password and username? All of that has to be thought about before drafting the franchise agreement. If it's an outlet, what if the tenancy ends and in 3 years the tenancy ends and the franchise agreement is 5 years? In 3 years, tenancy ends and the landlord does not want to renew. Is the franchisee allowed to move locations? And if he is allowed to move locations, what's the radius that he's allowed to move locations? So there's various elements that goes into a franchise agreement, and all of this must be well thought out before the agreement is finalized. Here are some of the important contents in the franchise agreement. The recital, the start explaining the business relationship between the parties, grant of rights, term and territorial rights between the parties, IP rights and assignment, termination, renewal, and breach. What happens if there's a breach, obligations as well. In the Franchise Act, one of the requirements is that the duration of the agreement cannot be anything less than 5 years. It must be 5 years. You can have it more, but you can't have a term that duration that's less. The termination of the franchise term may occur earlier, and it's allowed to occur earlier if there's mutual agreement between both parties. And this is also stated in the Act. So if both parties mutually agree to terminate, then it's fine. Also, where termination is decided by courts. The franchisor is not allowed to terminate the franchise agreement before its expiration unless there's good cause. So the reason why the Franchise Act has such strict requirements is because the act came into Malaysia and was enforced in Malaysia on the basis that franchisees should be protected. Franchisees are putting a large a large sum ahead, right? Franchise fee, a royalty fee, then if there's advertising and promotion collected, sometimes training fee is also collected, then there's outlet renovation fee. So to a large extent, depending on the type of franchise and depending on the brand, depending on the product, and depending on the size of the outlet, the capital that the franchisee puts forward can be quite substantial. Where it is substantial, it's not right for the franchisor to suddenly terminate the agreement. Because earlier I was talking about returns on investment. Most franchisors has a 3-year return on investment. Some might even have a 4-year return on investment. So if I'm only going to make back what I've put in 3 years or 4 years, if they terminate it before the end of 5 years, I won't even see my profits. I've just wasted expenses. I've just put in all my investment and not seen the returns. So that is why this term exists in the Franchise Act. So there is a lot of reasons, there's a lot of justification of why the Franchise Act must be followed through. It's to take care of the franchisee who's putting forward the capital. Now, breach in the agreement, if there's remediable breach, that means the breach can be corrected, then 14 days must be given for the franchisee to correct the breach. Where it cannot be corrected, then also the agreement can be terminated. Example where it cannot be corrected is assignment of franchise rights to others without proper authorization. There's a voluntary abandonment of the business. For example, take a restaurant in a mall, for instance, and malls are open even when there's public holidays and during the weekend. But when one outlet is not open, it has a very bad image on that entire mall, right? How many of us have seen an outlet closed in the popular malls, Pavilion, KLCC, Mid Valley, One Utama? For those who are not from Malaysia, I'm naming ones in the Klang Valley. So we have never seen that. And the reason is it's part of the tenancy agreement that they're not allowed to close the shop because it tarnishes the image of the mall. So voluntary abandonment of the business can even include 1 or 2 days of not opening the outlet without permission from the franchisor. And that's a irremediable breach because you can't go back and do it. You can't correct it. You've already done that, right? So that's an example of voluntary abandonment of the business. Conviction of a criminal offense that significantly damages the goodwill associated with the intellectual property rights, and entering into liquidation or insolvency proceedings as well. Others is challenging the intellectual property rights of the franchisor, also irremediable, and repeated failure. So, earlier we said that, okay, some parts can be corrected and these are given 14 days. But what if that franchisee keeps breaching and then keeps correcting it within 14 days? That's also not consistent and that's not respecting the franchise agreement. So repeated failure to comply is also considered irremediable breach. Section 34 addresses renewal. Renewal, as mentioned earlier in the franchise agreement, is something that's very important because the franchisor cannot simply not renew. There must be good grounds. That is in the second sentence. The franchisor is obligated to grant an extension to the franchisee subject to their application, except if there have been breaches of the terms of the agreement in the previous agreement. And towards the expiration of the agreement, it's going to expire. The franchisee has option to extend no less than 6 months in advance. Further to that, what's important for franchisors to note is that the new franchise agreement, the renewed franchise agreement, must contain terms that are either similar or not less favorable than those specified in previous agreements. In terms of this specific clause, sometimes clients ask, does that mean that my franchise fee cannot change? Does that mean that my royalty stays the same way? I can't increase the royalty fee? No. Even though it says that it should have similar terms and not less favorable, the franchise registry accepts that there is inflation. There will be an increase, but the increase might not be outrageous. That's what this clause addresses. Some of the obligations of the franchisor are site selection assistance, training sessions, operation and training manuals, equipment and material guidance, product supply and technical assistance, system and concept disclosure, management, and so all of this, right, are basically why I mentioned earlier that when a business owner becomes a franchisor, their role changes. All of this become very important. So if the business owner is still very busy and hands-on their own business, where it's their own outlet that they are managing, it is very difficult to then grow your franchise because you then should become a trainer. You become a person that's monitoring your franchisee, training your franchisee, a consultant to your franchisee with all these requirements. Section 20 is important. Again, these presentations actually are very much on very frequent questions that we come across in the franchise industry and with clients. Some clients will be like, Gita, I want to use a different fee, franchise fee for Klang Valley, understandably so, because it's more affluent area compared to maybe northern Malaysia, maybe southern Malaysia, right? Maybe Johor, Perak, Terengganu must have a different franchise fee. It's not right to collect the same as someone based in Klang Valley. The Act, our Franchise Act, Section 20, prohibits against discrimination, meaning that you cannot have an agreement that's different for different regions if it's not filed in the registry. So what we've done is you must disclose it that different regions have different fees and that must be disclosed in the franchise agreement. And that agreement then is filed in the franchise registry with variations of franchise fee for different regions if you have that different fee. Right, so it cannot be file a franchise agreement with one set of fees in the franchise registry, but you go ahead and do different set of fees for different franchisees. Then you're breaching the Franchise Act. All right, let's go to registration of franchise in Malaysia. How is it done? Well, all the documents are needed, right? Your franchise agreement is needed, operation manual and training manual is required. Then you have a franchise disclosure document that must be prepared. And then only we proceed with MyFax filing, which is the filing with the franchise registry. Franchise agreement governs the relationship within the parties. Operation manual governs the standard operating procedures of each step, the A to Z of running of the business. Training manual is basically information on how the franchisee will be trained, when will he be trained, on what aspects of the business. Franchise disclosure document is the overview of the business because this document is given to the franchisee. The franchise agreement and the franchise disclosure is given to the franchisee. With the franchise agreement and the franchise disclosure, the franchisee can then analyze, do I want to take up this franchise? Do I make back the money in that certain time period? What do I need to do? What fees I need to pay? What do I get from the franchisor? What support do I get from the franchisor? So all of this is information that a franchisee needs before making a decision on whether to take up the franchise business. Only then we look at the MyFax filing. So you can't go to any consultant and say, okay, I want to register my franchise. There's so much that happens prior to the MyFax filing, the registration with the franchise registry. Now, MyFax 2.0 is basically the software or the registration system, which is where all registrations are filed into. It's on is managed by a franchise registry. They used to have MyFax 1.0, then they've upgraded to franchise MyFax 2.0, where data then had to be moved by our old clients who had it in 1.0. We had to move it to 2.0, and all registrations are now done with MyFax 2.0. This is the various parts that need to be filled in the franchise MyFax 2.0. Now, the duration of the registration process takes about 3 months from the from the completion of filing. Once all the documents are filed, from review and response by the franchise registry. If you do not meet any requirements, the franchise registry will raise an objection and ask you to respond. Then you respond and it proceeds to registration if it's approved by the franchise registry. Interestingly, foreign franchisor is not required to open a local bank account in Malaysia. There's some misconceptions there, so we also want to put that clear. All right. Now, is your business ready to be franchised? You have to analyze your business on its business feasibility. Is it a systematic business approach? Or is it very unique and it's very difficult to systemize the business? Some consultancies are very difficult to systemize because the consultancy approach is different systems are used for different types of business when you're consulting. Is it a teachable concept? I met someone actually about a month ago, and it's very interesting. His business is where he connects the business owner with relevant ministries in the government. So he's basically the government liaison, right? So many of our businesses relate to contracts with government. It might be a tender, it might be projects with government that you are applying for. So he is the business contact, the liaison with government. And I was speaking to this individual and I was asking him, how do you scale up your business? Because it all relies on you. It's your relationship with ministers, it's your relationship with government officials. And it was a laughable moment at that time because he was saying, yes, I can't scale up because it relies on me. So this is an example of business feasibility. Not all businesses can be franchised. You have to break it down to, can my business have a standard operating procedure? Can it be a teachable? Can I duplicate it? Right? That's business feasibility. Financial stability. Financial stability is, it is profitable, right? It's heading in the direction that after 3 or 4 years of investment, uh, the franchisee can actually see revenue. In the end, what are franchisees in it for? The franchisees are in the franchise business model for the same reason the franchisors are in the business model. Franchisors are in the business model because they want to make money. They want a franchise fee. Remember earlier the benefits of franchising? So franchisors are in there for apart from collecting money and collecting funds, is also for brand awareness. The marketing presence is much more impactful when there's a lot of outlets around, and also capital. They don't need to put your own capital to expand, right? But they also collect a franchise fee. So of course, one of the benefits of franchising is there's revenue, passive. I mean, it's horrible to say the word passive because actually there's a lot of support needed to be given to the franchisee. So it's not actually passive; it's active, active income. So it's another stream of revenue for a business owner. But that stream of revenue can only be positive if you have more and more franchisees. The volume of franchisees increases if the franchisee is actually making money. You have to remember that franchisees will talk to other franchisees. That's the best way to even analyze whether that franchise is worth taking. Is it worth taking up that franchise, right? If it's not worth taking up that franchise, why would it grow? So actually, it's very important to think about that. To think about how quickly Cha Time, which used to be Cha Time, now it's Tea Life, how quickly it grew. The other one that grew very quickly is also Nelson's Corn in the Cup, right? These are all kiosk. Kiosk franchises is a type of franchise, type of business model for a franchise. The capital that one needs to put forward is smaller, naturally, because it's a smaller space. There's less capital investment. And the returns on investment would be a lot faster. And that's why you see so many of them, because the returns on investment is faster and the franchisee sees profit. And that is very much related to finances. So the franchisor needs to really ensure that there is a very good return on investment in a quick way. Right, next, you have target market and demand. You have a clear target audience. There is differentiation in the product, right? In the product or service delivered, and it possesses a good market plan to promote consistency, right? So these are the considerations you want to see if your business is ready to be franchised. So if you've not yet reached the 3-year time limit, all of this is what you're looking at. How do I systemize it? How do I ensure that returns on investment can be gained faster? How do I ensure that my brand is recognized in the marketplace? Many at times we also get clients asking us, Gita, should I take up this franchise? And I look at the brand, I'm like, I've never heard of this brand. And then when you look at the fact that it's not known, a big question mark comes in is, if you're paying a franchise fee for a brand that's not known, the franchisor better have a plan to do have high level of advertising and promotion. Because one of the reasons a franchisee takes a brand is because they don't need to do that much of marketing and promotion. Because it's a brand that's already known. A brand that's already known will bring in the traffic, bring in the revenue, right? You no, you never need to take up a franchise model from McDonald's and then market McDonald's. You don't need to tell people what McDonald's is, right? So the marketing and the brand recognition and familiarity needs to be there. The same reason why people take up a franchise is as a franchisor, you have to think about that. Why would people be interested in your franchise if it doesn't have a brand recognition in Malaysia or in any country that you want to expand? All right, it might be overload of information today, and I'm really sorry for that. I didn't mean to scare you. But as Mark Twain said, the secret of getting ahead is to get started. Also, knowledge is power. So, with that, I really hope that the knowledge that you gain today will really help you expand your business. Or if you're looking at becoming a franchisee, you know what's ahead, what lies ahead. Now we move on very quickly to tips on selecting an awesome franchisee. It is very much related to compatibility. One is this franchisee dynamic? Is he actually going to run the business in the way that you want? So you want it's very interesting explaining this because it's like you want them to be dynamic, you want them to be driven, entrepreneurial, to have entrepreneurial skills, but to not surpass the boundary that you put, not to cross the boundaries that you set in your franchise agreement, in your SOP. So that it's a very tricky one, that really is a tricky one. So that's why the interview process is very important. You have to define your ideal candidate. So you actually have to say, okay, who you're looking for, what kind, how many years of experience, what kind of business experience does you want him to be, what age, what demographic does this candidate need to be in. All that has to be thought through. You really have to identify that. Then you have to look at franchisee compatibility. That from his background, does he actually relate to your personality and your core values? Financial assessment. Do they actually have a good financial standing? Where are they going to get the funds from? Are they actually going to get a loan? Are they capable of getting a loan? Then basic business know-how and entrepreneurial drive. Do they have the entrepreneurial drive? And is the franchisee a good fit for this franchise? So in terms of ideal candidate, you're looking at your brand mission, core values, and foundational traits. Then you see whether do they align with that. And again, goes to different industries, right? Ideal candidate differs from industry to industry. So you can see here where it's healthcare, you're looking at their knowledge and qualification in healthcare. We actually assisted some pharmacies to franchise their pharmacy, and that was a very much an interesting business because you need a pharmacist to run a pharmacy. So it's not so easy to, again to select. It narrows down the people out there that you can actually get as a franchisee. Food and beverage retail outlets usually prefer those who have been in the F&B business, and kids and children. Uh, if it's the education industry, then it's going to be related to do they have any experience in that industry. Here are some examples of actual cases where you can see how they choose their ideal candidate. Future Kids Academy, for example, says that they want someone with sales and marketing experience, general business management experience, familiarity with computers, interest in children and education, sufficient operating capital, and strong entrepreneurial spirit. So they've stated that Kumon looks at Malaysian citizen and a degree holder in any discipline or or professional qualification with a credit in maths and English. So they specify that those two are important, and great interpersonal and communication skills and ability to commit full time. So number 3 is very interesting because sometimes franchisees want to invest and hire people. They don't want to be a full-time business operator, right? They're like, this is supposed to be my passive income. Why are you asking me to work? I don't want to work, right? So number 3 is interesting because franchisors usually do not want franchisees who are just investors. And anyone knows the reason for that? Why franchisees who are not just investors are not good? The quick answer is franchisees who are investors don't have consistency and don't control all the rules and regulations. A business is successful when someone comes in full time and is committed, right? So that's why franchisors don't like franchisees that are just investors and hiring others to run the business. Right? These are other examples. If you want it, just email us. We will send you. If you want the slides as well, some parts of the slides can be sent. A summarized version because there's 80 plus slides. So we'll send you a summarized version. Tip two, to evaluate if the franchisee is a good fit, well, there are some red flags to look out for. If they're not properly capitalized, so you always see where are the funds coming from. As any business, it takes time before you break even. So there needs to be reserve capital before it breaks even, right? So that is actually very important. And that's where it's very dangerous because the last thing you want is get a franchisee, sign everything, collect your franchise fee, but in a few years later, they close shop, right? Because it's bad for the image of the brand for it to suddenly close shop. So that's very important. Also, they have unreasonable expectations. This is where it's very important to have a very honest conversation with them and all the data needs to be transparent. Next is their mindset and personality does not match with your brand. So you'll have to see. Some of the franchisors that we meet only choose franchisees who love their brand, who are like die-hard um, fan of their brand. Right, and how do they know? Well, they'll ask a lot of questions. How have you eaten at the outlet? Where do you eat? Have you visited the outlet this part of the country and so on? So that's interesting in terms of the mindset and personality part. Third one, franchisees should have basic business know-how and entrepreneurial drive. Well, I think I've touched on this already. Why is it very, very important? So I won't go into that. Compatibility of the franchisee. Well, it's the key things about it being driven. It's having driven, being passionate, having the right work ethics, right? So it's a relationship like any other relationship. Once I gave a talk where I said franchisor and franchisee relationship is like a marriage. And the reason was really there must be really open communication. And there must be both having a win-win outlook in the business relationship, right? So I mean, like marriage, you have a win-win outlook, it will be a successful marriage if any dispute can be solved if you go in with that kind of attitude. Again, compatibility of the franchisee, beware of the red flags. Money, very money oriented, keep looking at when can I make the money, when can I get the profits, and not patient to build the business. Punctuality, lacking punctuality, that shows there's no proper work ethics, there's no discipline, and differential interests. So always questioning on strict adherences. That means all the rules and regulations, you keep questioning why do they exist. That's going to be a problem because that's how consistency in a franchise is managed. And then they are also franchising as a part-time, right? They're not looking at it as a full-time and they might be running a few businesses. When they're running a few businesses, then there's lack of commitment. When there's lack of commitment, there's lack of consistency. When there's lack of consistency, there's a tarnishing of image of the franchisor's brand. The last one, financial assessment of the franchisee. All of this actually you can assess. You same thing. It's very similar to a bank assessment when they're giving a loan, right? When they're providing a loan or providing a credit card, all these questions are asked. So it's very important for the franchisor, sorry, to also ask these questions. Where is the funds coming from? Where, how will you be funding it for the first 3 years and so on? How do you then figure this out? These 5 tips of how do you find out an awesome franchisee? Well, you need to have an interview and a screening process, right? This itself is a process. It goes through background checks, interviews, just like how you're hiring a staff. You might have a second interview, a third interview, come and visit my outlet. A lot of discussions. That is when you actually get closer and closer to finding an awesome franchisee. Right. With that, I'm going to actually bring this to an end so I can address questions. Here's some success story. Recently, we had Bata receiving their franchise registration, and our team was in Putrajaya. They had a booth there as the Minister of KPDN, KK, was there as well. And Faruni registered their franchise within 6 months. So that was successful on their end as well, and we assisted them. All right, I would like to address any questions actually.